I remembered something. That's not always a given on a Sunday morning. Can y'all hear us in the Zoom room?
Yeah,
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yes.
Yep, we can hear you too.
Okay,
Great.
then we'll watch what we're gonna say.
No.
Hi, Terrence. Are you there? It's Linda.
Hello, how you doing, Linda? Sorry,
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. Getting set up here real quick. I'm actually playing piano this morning at a partner church, so I'm down in their basement getting
my
my
gosh.
laptop and stuff together.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here with us.
Terrance, do you need to share your screen at all during this?
No, I hadn't planned on it. I was hoping, say a few things and have some good dialogue. So no.
Great, good, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, bubble wrap. Okay, I promise I won't do it.
It's been in my car.
I have to move
I
it.
take this in the marriage.
You know, you talk about the temptations of Jesus.
This is your
tempting.
temptation.
I can't leave it there.
But there's no negative from. No, there's not.
Excuse me. Did you survive? Like,
Me, you had to get up and do an 8 o'clock service today.
I came back here and worked.
No.
Yeah, I had a lot to get ready for,
Yeah.
but tomorrow is coming
It's
You're taking tomorrow off.
for the most part.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's, I was thinking about it, you get tired just from sitting. Why do you get tired just from sitting?
Oh, you do? Oh, you had convention yesterday.
Convention, yeah.
Mhm.
And I'm just going, I don't understand. But charge my.
We're live, by the way.
Oh, we are, okay.
Hmm. Oh, speaking of which, I need to go knock the air down a little bit.
Yes, right here.
Hi, Eric. Good to see you.
Linda, I'm gonna run out for a second and knock the heat down in the nave because it's hot. So I will be right back. I meant to do that before we got started. So if y'all want to get started while I'm away, feel free to do that.
Okay. And Alva, you're introducing, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll have to excuse myself around 10 to go to, I'm going to do choir. So,
Okay.
so if I step out, that's what I'm doing.
I would love to have choir today.
Yeah, there'll be some people. I don't know how many.
Okay.
You know, you can take off your mask if you want to.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Are you okay with us not wearing?
Yes, I'm totally
Okay,
fine.
okay.
I'm going to be wearing my mask a lot because I'm going to be singing.
Oh, that's right. yeah.
So it doesn't make a big difference to me. It doesn't bother me very much to wear a mask.
Good morning. Come on up
Hey.
to the table.
Mr. Popularity, Stan, you were quoted left and right in today's paper.
Oh, really?
Oh,
What's it about?
It's
about safety.
Safety water.
Treatment.
Oh, I hadn't read that one yet.
It started on the
After
front
the
page and then
fire?
it was,
No,
no.
this was unrelated to that. Although John Dean, who's doing this in Bravo Radio, he's kind of, he and I have discovered each other, and so
I
he's
see.
called me on it. And we've had 4 or 5 conversations in the last month.
I see.
So that's just what I do.
Yeah.
Sorry for that, I thought we were past time. No, I like that he's got those columns because nowadays, when we hear all this stuff, there's no climate change.
Mm.
And yesterday, one of the things was creation care. So are you on that? Were you on the planning for that?
Yes.
For the guys?
But yes, I'm
Oh,
on
good
that
for
committee.
you. Good.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to give everybody about a minute more to get logged in. I'm happy to see so many faces. Welcome to you, Terrance, Mr. Hawkins, for being our guest speaker today. I was reading some of your bio and I have to ask you, young man, do you sleep?
It's a little.
I thought I was a busy bee. Gosh, boy, you run in circles even around me, and that's saying something. But we're going to give everybody about a minute more to get logged in. Just a few house rules of going forward, which we should all be familiar with during this pandemic of Zooming and rooming and all that good stuff. If you could, please remain muted during our session this morning. There will be time for a Q&A just before we wrap up. If you have any questions or statements you would like to be presented towards that time, please use this chat space to place them in. For those who are in person, just use your little raise your hand if you will have a question or a comment. My name is Alvi Dove Ali. I am the co-chair of St. Anne's Outreach Committee, and it is my joy and my pleasure to welcome you all to Building Bridges for Equity, Justice, and Community. This is a 6-week Lenten adult formation series. I'm saying that fast 3 times. That will focus on our many community partners and ways that we as members of a loving and woke community to strive to be more loving and open and do the work that needs to be done to follow in the way of Christ. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today. It's Mr. Terrance Hawkins. He is has a plethora of organizations underneath his belt. And like I was joking with him earlier, young man, do you sleep? His bio information was sent out to the congregation. So for those of you who do not read our church newsletter, you are really missing out. Mr. Hawkins is a youth director with Lit City. He also works with the School of Love. You just do so much. So I'm going to allow him to just go ahead and proclaim his awesomeness, because I feel like I cannot do you justice, young man. So I present Mr. Terrance Hawkins, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here with you all this morning virtually. I was nudged and invited directly through Miss Linda. And one of the things that she raised in our conversation about me possibly coming was a speech, talk, whatever you would call it, that I gave at an anti-gun violence rally maybe 3 or 4 months ago. And in that speech, I shared a parable that I have shared over and over and over ad nauseum over the last probably 10 years, primarily with Black and Brown young folks, to help them get a sense of what was happening in their own lives. And she mentioned that you all had engaged, some of you all had engaged that video and even had some discussions around it. And so I'm gonna kind of center my comments this morning on that. I think I sent a title that was something to the effect of becoming accomplices of Christ in the work of healing justice. And so we'll try to get inside of that a little bit. Before I recount this parable, I want to read 3 quotes, 2 from sacred scripture and 1 from one of the more prominent figures of what we would call the Black radical tradition. The first verse or passage is from Daniel, the prophet Daniel, and it reads, "Then Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, 'Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire?' They replied, 'Certainly, your majesty.' He said, 'Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods.'" The second passage I want to read is really like a life passage for me. I like to call it Jesus's abolitionist manifesto. And it's found in Luke chapter 4, verse 17. It says the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom to the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, and to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of everyone were fixed on him. And he said, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And the last passage is not from sacred scripture, but I view it as sacred nonetheless. It's from Huey P. Newton, whose father was actually a Black preacher who I would say was a part of this grand tradition of resistance rooted in our faith. Huey P. Newton once said, "Youth are passed through schools that don't teach, then forced to search for jobs that don't exist, and finally left stranded to stare at the glamorous lives advertised around them." Let me whisper a prayer and we'll get into this parable. God, let the words of my mouth and meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord God, my strength, my redeemer, the one in whom I trust. So 10 teenagers were blindfolded and escorted into a small room. Once escorted in, the door was closed and locked from the outside, and a voice from an intercom said, "You may now take your blindfolds off." The teenagers removed the blindfolds to find that they were in a small room and that on every single wall within this room were plasma screen televisions. As they stared around the room and looked at those televisions, what they became aware of is that these televisions were piping in live streams of some of the best food in the world being prepared, cooked, served, and eaten. And so as hours go by and they're unable to get themselves out of the room, this situation becomes a little bit more stressful. And finally, a full day passes by. These young teenagers, 10 teenagers locked in a small room, and they are forced to look at plasma screen televisions with the best food in the world being prepared, cooked, served, and eaten. In this room, there is no food. In this room, there is no water. And so after that first 24 hours, they are beginning to feel a little bit hungry. Maybe not a little bit, a lot, very hungry. Y'all know how teenagers are. If you've ever had children or been around teenagers, they can eat you out of a house and a home. And so 24 hours with no food is quite an experience. 24 hours turns into 48 hours of being locked in this room with no way of escape, and adding injury to insult. Every single moment that they look up at a wall, they are being forced to look and view the best food in the world being prepared, cooked, served, and eaten. 48 hours turns to 3 days, 3 days turns to 5 days. At the 5th day, they have really gone into a time, they have really fallen into deep crisis. Their mental health is shattered. Their stress levels are on a high. Their hunger is unbearable. As we would say, their stomachs are touching their backs. And they're angry, frustrated, and that anger and frustration is not only harming their own souls, it's leaking out onto each other as they continue to not be able to break themselves free from this room and to be tormented by the images of this great food being prepared, cooked, served, and eaten. 5 days turns to 7 days, 7 days turns to 8 days, 8 days turns to 10 days, and the situation couldn't be more desperate. These young folks have not eaten anything or drunk anything in a full 10-day period. They are beyond exhausted. Their bodies are weak. Their spirits are worn. Their mental health is horrible, and they are not in any way, shape, or form having any sense of hope. They have come to the conclusion that this is our lot. We will be locked in here forever, and there's nothing else for us. We are doomed. All of a sudden, on that 10th day, a bell rings, the door opens, and a man with a sinister smile appears in front of the door. and he flings a large piece of steak into the middle of the room, and no sooner than he had appeared, he disappeared. The door was locked from the outside. These 10 teenagers looked each other in the eye and looked at the steak, and within a few seconds, they all made a dash for the steak in desperation and hunger, and in trying to get to that steak, they tore each other apart. Fighting, clawing, punching, kicking, screaming, profanity. Everything is happening in this room, all because this hunger is at a peak, and it looks like there's a chance for them to maybe just get a small crumb, but a small crumb will be better than nothing. At the very same time that the steak was thrown into the middle of the room, a stream was sent to all of the major news networks in the world. MSNBC, NBC, CNN, Fox News, all of the major news networks are now showing the live footage. Local news networks are covering this. And the whole world is gazing in on these young folks ripping each other to shreds in the quest to grab and have one small piece of steak. The important piece of information that the entire world doesn't know is that these young folks had endured 10 days being locked in this room. They have no idea that they haven't eaten in 10 days. They have no idea of the mental health and levels of trauma that they are experiencing. All they see is young people ripping each other to shreds to get one piece of steak. And so the world comes to the conclusion that these young folks must be savages. These young folks must be predators. These young folks must be irredeemable. These young folks probably deserve to be locked in cages. These young folks don't deserve care. These young folks are destined for destruction. Look at them. They're tearing each other apart. They're killing themselves. They're killing each other. And I share that parable often to try to bring context to some of the things that ail poor, oppressed communities of all colors, but specifically Black and Brown communities. Too often when we look at issues in certain communities, the hood, the barrio, the res, the trailer park, we look at them in isolation to the context. We zoom in on what we perceive as depravity. We zoom in on what we perceive as evil. We zoom in on what we see as cultural, quote unquote, pathologies, but never zoom out to understand that there is a pathological history of injustice and deprivation and oppression that has actually engendered or created the conditions where young folks feel like the only option is to get in the streets. The only option is to be a part of a gang. The only option is to do this, that, and the third extra legal activity that's dangerous, risky, and could end me up in a cage or a grave. And this is tragic, and this is by design. There's a quote that went viral on Facebook that said, trauma in a person or an individual over time can be understood. If it's decontextualized, it can be understood as personality. And then it says trauma in a family, if it's decontextualized, can be understood as just plain old family traits. This is just how this family is. It's in their blood. And then trauma decontextualized from a people group can be understood as culture. And how often have we heard those who have been traumatized and deprived looked upon individualistically and thought to be just bad people, thought to be folks who have inherent traits that lead them to certain activity. We look at quote unquote culture within communities and assume that this is just the way these people are. When the fact of the matter is, and this is, I'm going to riff off of Martin Luther King Jr. It's King in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos, said that it is a torturous logic to look at the symptoms of segregation and oppression and make a case for its continuance. In essence, he was saying that what we see in communities, whether it's quote unquote crime, whether it's unhealthy behaviors, he was saying that those things are symptoms, that those things aren't racial character traits, they're environmental. But unfortunately, as woke as we may be, as many anti-racism books as we may have read, as many panel discussions as we may have listened to, as many documentary films as we may have watched, as many protests as we may have shown up to, as many times as we have donated to justice causes, each and every one of us are infected with the lie and myth of white supremacy, the lie and myth of race itself. Race is a deadly fiction with very real, deadly consequences. It is a lie. It is the lie that says that those of European descent, by some divine design, are inherently superior, morally pure, and given this birthright, as W.B. Du Bois would say, to own the land forever and ever and ever. Given this birthright to control, to lead, to dominate, to be at the center, to be the norm. And the counterpart to that lie is the myth that people of darker complexion are inherently criminal, are inherently created to be subservient, that they are morally inferior, that they are impure, that they cannot be centered, that they cannot lead themselves, that they need the paternalistic help of good white liberals or conservatives or whatever your political hue is. They need them to come up and save them. That lie, as much as we may intellectually know it's a lie, that lie permeates through our souls. It permeates through our systems. It permeates through our churches. It permeates through our daily habits. It permeates through so much of our lives. And it's a lie that we must reckon with as disciples of Jesus. The Jesus who said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," not to maintain the status quo, not to keep people locked in cycles of poverty, but to preach good news to the poor. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, not to maintain this deadly system of hunting and caging people and throwing them away because of a mistake that they made. No, but to proclaim freedom to prisoners. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, not to restrict and restrain folks from accessing health and care and healing. No, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to heal, to heal. Then he says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me to set the oppressed free. And if we are endowed with that Spirit, if we are called to embody that Spirit, we are being called to be God's accomplices in the work of healing justice. Healing justice is a term that some organizers use. And really what we're trying to get at is the reality that justice is a prerequisite for healing in the social realm. Justice is a prerequisite for healing in the social realm. How many times have y'all seen over the years? I see folks with salt and pepper, so I'm going to assume y'all got some decades on you and you've been blessed and privileged and honored to see a few things over the course of your lives. How many of y'all have ever seen some, horrible racist tragedy take place on a national or local level, whether it was 1992 in the wake of the acquittal of the officers who brutally beat Black motorist Rodney King, or whether it was 2012 Trayvon Martin's murder, or 2014 the Ferguson uprising, or 2016 the death of our dear beloved white sister Heather Heyer, who was killed by white supremacists in Charlottesville, whether it was 2016 with the emergence of Donald Trump, the Christo-fascist in chief, whatever it was. How many of us have seen the response to that within our faith spaces to be, let's have a space of racial healing. Let's come together and have some racial reconciliation. Let's work for racial peace and unity. And it is quite problematic. to believe that we might be able to hug out 400, 500 years of racial oppressions. It is quite problematic to believe that healing of a community and of historic lines of division rooted in oppression can come through just dialogue. These things come as a result of the hard, tedious, painful, costly work of justice. As the prophet Micah said, God has told you, O mortal, what is required of you, that you do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. And so we believe, many of us believe, that the work of justice is a healing work. I'm going to give y'all a little, a story of mine that I think sort of underscores this. I was having some back problems, I think 4 or 5 years ago, and it was suggested that I go to the chiropractor. So I went to the chiropractor, and the chiropractor did, was it an X-ray? He did something. Yeah, I guess it would have been an X-ray. Anyways, he was trying to look at my spine, my back, see what was going on, what might be causing the pain I was experiencing. And he took me back to the room and showed me the image of the X-ray. And he pointed to my stomach. And my stomach had like this like black, it was like black. It was like a black cloud over my stomach. And he was like, do you know what that is? And I honestly was getting nervous. I was like, no, I don't know what that is. And he said, pretty directly, that's poop. I said, what? Okay. He was like, yeah, that's poop. I was like, okay, say more, doc. And he said, well, you have what we call, there's a like a bigger word for it, but the layman's term is stair step back, if I remember correctly. But you have what we call stair step back, and basically like your back is like kind of like a stair step, and that actually impedes you from actually eliminating the things that you need to eliminate. And I said to him, I said, doc, wow, okay, that makes sense of some things, but you know what? I'm actually on this really, really strict 90-day fitness challenge. I'm working out, I'm eating clean, like everything I'm eating is clean, and it's really like revolutionizing my health. So I'm pretty sure if I continue to work out, eat clean, drink my water, and do those things, like it'll work itself out. And he said, that's great, continue to do those things. But what you have here is a structural problem. Until your back is brought into alignment, yes, you may be able to have some impact by eating clean, but until your back is in alignment, this dark matter here is for the most part going to remain. And the moment he said that, because I'm a preacher, I immediately caught the metaphor. That often we want to tell the poor, the oppressed, the Black, the brown communities to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, to engage good and healthy habits, to budget better, to be more attentive at school, to pull your britches up, to stop listening to that hip hop. And some of those things might be fine and dandy. And as a youth worker, youth development worker, we have all kinds of conversations around the poisonous influence of media, all kinds of conversations about being serious about your education. We do all those conversations. Those conversations are important. However, especially for white folks, especially for folks who consider themselves followers of Jesus, we have to be concerned with the structures. And until there's an alignment of the structures of our city, state, nation, and world with the love of God, and that love demands justice, there will continue to be so many of the problems that we see. We'll continue to see those things. And so the call of justice is a call of healing work that demands we give attention to systemic oppression, structural injustice, and that we use our time, talent, and treasures to try to work in that way. And so for the next 5 minutes, I'll share a few thoughts, and hopefully that'll give us plenty of time to dialogue. I don't want to just, have a monologue, because I'm sure there's lots of wisdom in the room, and maybe even questions that I can just sort of try to respond to. So I read the passage from Daniel, where we know the Hebrew boys are in a situation of imperialism. They are under the control of a deadly empire, and this empire is putting certain demands on their daily lives. And these young men decide that they're not going to give in to some of these demands, and it ends up costing them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown in the fiery furnace. This is basically what happens to folks who resist empires in every generation, every nation, every cultural context. If you resist the powers, you can guarantee that the powers will do all they can to eliminate you, to suppress your voice, to perhaps even take your life. And so in this case, the empire is looking to take the lives of these young men, and they're thrown into the fiery furnace. And the expectation is that they're just going to burn to nothing. And we know the story. They look in and they find one like a son of the gods. And, evangelical readings of that want to say the son of God because it preaches better. But I think the original Hebrew is a son of the gods, which is fine as well. You can do a lot with that. We can preach. That'll preach too. But the point is that in this moment where they're locked in to this fiery furnace, there's another presence that shows up. And that other presence is responsible for them being able to actually survive. And not only to survive, but to live and flourish. And so when we think about the work of being Christ's accomplices, we first and foremost have to see ourselves as needy individuals who are dependent upon the Spirit of God to show up in us, with us, for us, and through us. We need God's love. We need encounters with God's presence that build us up, that strengthen us, that help us deal with our own frailties, that help us deal with our own contradictions. The work of justice is both personal and communal. It demands something of us in terms of our personal transformation, and it demands that we wrestle and get in community with folks and struggle together and dialogue together and try and experiment together and fail together and fail again better and fail again and again better, but keep pushing forward as Fannie Lou Hamer. Even if we fall, may I fall 5'4" forward in the cause of justice. Fannie Lou Hamer, that great Black farmer, organizer, political activist, and Jesus follower. She was 5'4" in stature, but a giant in the faith. And so we need Christ's presence with us, but we also have to understand that Christ is already in community with those who Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, or those that Jesus called the least and the last. Christ is already in the hood. Christ is already in the barrio. Nobody's bringing Jesus, the Holy Ghost, God, to East Winston, to Northeast Winston, to Patterson Avenue, to Rolling Hills, to Lakeside Villa. Nobody's bringing God there. God is already there. And I think that's such an important thing to note, because often, even when we got great intentions, us folks that are racially categorized as white, us folks that are economically privileged, folks who have some education, folks who have access, can assume that, like, I'm bringing something to the table that's going to fix this problem. And what we must understand is that we're coming alongside a community where the presence of God is already at work, and there are already things happening that are designed to bring about transformation. And so seeing ourselves as accomplices, especially I'm talking to a predominantly a group of white brothers, sisters, siblings in the faith. I want to just name a few traits that we hopefully can embrace in this work, and then we'll get into some dialogue. So this is something I made quite some time ago, and it says 7 traits of an anti-racist disciple. And what I'm learning more and more is anti-racism is a good frame, but we also have to, it may be better just to say 7 traits of an anti-oppression disciple, because we understand oppressions overlap. And when we leave one group out, we're missing the full picture of what we're trying to overcome. So first and foremost, we must be listeners. In the Bible, James the Just, Jesus's brother, said, "Be slow to listen. Slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to anger." My cousin, who was a preacher, used to say, "God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth," which means God wants you listening twice as much as you're talking. And so anti-racist disciples, anti-oppression disciples must embrace the ministry of listening, especially listening to folks who are most vulnerable and listening to the voices of those who have done work within their community and are really seeking change. Secondly, lifelong learners. White supremacy is pervasive and complex, and it requires a lifelong commitment of learning and unlearning. The resources abound, and it's our job not to turn Black and brown folks into like your walking Siri, but to like do that self-work, that self-education, and grab the books, spend time in the community so that you can learn. And one important part of that for us as Christians is decolonizing our theology. We've inherited what I call Euro-colonial Christianity, and it upholds so much of the evil that we're seeking to overcome. Thirdly, anti-racist disciples must be lamenters. Oscar Romero once said that there are some things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried. If this stuff does not rip your heart to shreds, if you've shed no tears, if you've felt no deep grief, you are not prepared to join in the struggle for revolutionary change. So we must embrace the call to lament. Lament in the Bible is actually an act of worship that too often Western churches skip over. Fourthly, we must be loss embracers. Jesus said that if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to take up a cross and embrace loss. And too often there are those, in the words of James Cone, that want justice without any loss, any risk. And there's no way for us to create a just society without us embracing so many practices that involve us losing. But here's what Jesus says to us followers. When you lose your life, when you redistribute some funds, when you invest some time that you may have been able to use doing something more pleasant and fun, you are actually gaining true life. So we must embrace loss. Institutional loss. All sorts of loss are demanded upon us if we're really serious about transforming these systems. We must be voice lifters. I think that goes without saying. Raise your voice in these interpersonal moments where you're seeing white supremacy, racism at work. Raise your voice alongside grassroots organizations. Join, support grassroots organizations, and make sure that you are not allowing silence to have the last word. 2 more. Long distance runners for justice. This is not a sprint, y'all. It's a marathon. And we must embrace that the reality that this is a long struggle. It's a generational, multi-generational struggle. And that requires that we got to take care of ourselves. We have to care for ourselves. We have to learn that art of abounding in selfless love while also creating reasonable boundaries to care for ourselves, to engage in self-compassion. And then lastly, we must be revolutionary lovers. Love is at the center of our call. It must be at the center of our struggle. And the love of God cannot be barricaded by race, cannot be barricaded by class, by gender, by sexuality, even by national borders, which means that we must love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And that has implications globally. It makes us look with lament at what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Palestine, Somalia, Syria, you name it, Latin America, wherever there is oppression and injustice, especially those of us that live in the United States, the most powerful empire in the world. We have a responsibility to speak out against what our nation is doing, what our tax dollars, are going towards. So I'll close there and just I'll close there and open it up for whatever dialogue we want to have. Hopefully some of those ramblings made sense.
And to all God's children say amen.
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 Thank you again, Terrence. That I can probably listen to you preach and teach pretty much all day long. Does anyone? God, thank you. I'm in awe right now. You left me speechless, and to anybody that knows me, that's a good thing. Does anyone have any comments or questions that they would like to share? Either raise your hand or use the chat space.
There's a question.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Brad. It says, do you, Terrence, have a hierarchy of healing justice? We all have to decide where we engage or where our gifts might align, but what has been your clarity? Thank you, Brad, for that.
Wow. What's up, brother Brad? Good to see you. That's a good question. Very good question. I wouldn't say I have if I'm understanding the question properly, I wouldn't necessarily call it a hierarchy. But here's one way I talk about it with students and adults. If I walk into a room and there's somebody whose leg is literally like in the shape of, I don't know, their leg is like falling off. And also within that room is someone who has a really bad paper cut. And also within that room is someone who has a bad headache. If I'm trying to show up in that room in the proper way and be responsive, who do I probably center my work or support on? Paper cut, headache, or leg falling off?
Leg.
Right. The most harm has been done there. The most harm has been done there. And that doesn't mean that I can't be attentive to the headache, doesn't mean I can't be sensitive to the paper cut. It just means that like the most work, the most attention is needed here. And so I think that's generally how I would like to think of it. And there's a tendency in some spaces to zero in on different identities, and identity is absolutely important. I think we do better if we zero in on communities. So I believe in organizing based on neighborhoods, but like you can go broader and just say the Black community, working class, poor Black community of Winston-Salem. And that entails all kinds of diversity, being attentive to gender, being attentive to sexuality, being attentive to physical ability, being attentive to all these different things, age, education within that community. But if you can do interventions that center in on communities that have been most harmed, I think that is, for me, the best approach. And then I think, I love this part of your question. There is a choice that we all have to make, because I can't serve every single place as much as in my bio. I do realize that, you know, I ain't God, and I can't be everywhere and do all the things. And so I have limited capacity, as do each and every one of you. And so I think prayerfully discerning both what is happening in our city and where that work is being done, and then how our own unique gifts, experiences, resources can be brought to bear for that. And that's definitely a very personal question. I wouldn't recommend doing it in isolation from others, but I do think there are, you know, ways that everybody has a unique path to join. So some of you might say, you know, I'm gonna serve with Action for Equity because I'm a former teacher and I really care about young folks flourishing in our educational system. And I got some gifts and stuff and time I can bring to that. Some of you might say, you know what, I really want to serve, I want to do work around state violence. And maybe there's some reason for that. Maybe you were a former police officer who had an awakening and was like, yeah, I participated in this system and a lot of harm was done. And as an act of repentance, I'd like to see some of that harm healed. But we all have those individual decisions to make that should be prayerful and done in community. But there's a sister, Sarah Hines, who works with Housing Justice Now, and she has a group called, I think, Unity Wellness Center. I once heard her say, don't let the reality that you can't do all the things stop you from doing some of the things. And so find a place, work there, struggle there, understand that no organization is perfect. There are contradictions in every organization, and just prepare to remain. And if it gets to a point where you have to move forward, you do that. But that's my quick response, not so quick response. I see a second follow-up. How do you see the School of Love fitting into this? I think on one level, School of Love, which some of you may not know about that, it's an experimental project trying to bring together folks from a diversity of theological traditions, socioeconomic statuses, race, gender, so on and so forth, to do what I would call radical discipleship, which literally just means getting at the root. And the root call of a Jesus follower, as I understand, is loving God and loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. And then giving special attention to historic and present lines of oppression and division within that work of discipleship. So I think School of Love, hopefully over time, can help form folks who see no contradiction between loving Jesus and working for justice. Can be an experimental space where people can practice beloved community across these lines, and then kind of be a leaven that works itself into other churches, into communities. And then ultimately, not ultimately, but one other last thing that I'll say is mobilizing people of faith to support and work alongside grassroots organizations that are doing important work. So that's maybe an answer to how I see School of Love hopefully fitting into
that. Stan has a question.
Yes, Terrance, I loved your use of metaphors. I was particularly taken by sort of your injunction you just made about sometimes we can fall victim to trying to make the perfect the enemy of the good. But I also liked your metaphor about structures, and I'm going to remember that. But so my question is kind of to combine that metaphor with your metaphor about the people with the choice between the leg and the headache and the paper cut. And I teach students a lot about systems and structures, and there's lots of them. Which are the structures that, in your sense, are the ones where people's legs are falling off most acutely?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So,
and there's not a perfect answer to that either.
No, there's not. So Martin Luther King talked about the triplet evils, like basically his last year of bearing witness. He was on a prophetic assault, if you will, to condemn and call the United States away from its embrace of the triplet evils that he would say were racism, structural racism. Sometimes he would say poverty. Sometimes he would say capitalism. To me, those things, like, they go together. One's the mother, one's the child. We can dialogue about that if somebody wants to have an argument about capitalism. Not an argument, a good, healthy dialogue about capitalism. So capitalism and then militarism. He named those as like imminent threats that literally could cause this project called the United States to not exist, and then ultimately, continue to result in the maiming of limbs, the taking of life and breath, the robbing of destinies. And so I start with those three, and now I use the quintuplet evils. And so racism, capitalism, militarism, and then fourthly, climate catastrophe. A big $500 word that some folks use is plantationism. And what they're trying to say is, like, the world being turned into a plantation through European colonization set in motion what we're seeing as far as climate catastrophe. And then the fifth one is patriarchy or heteropatriarchy. Those are all like overlapping evils that I think are doing the most harm to us day in and day out. And so you could look how racism infiltrates the system of education. You can look at how most of those infiltrate our systems that we interact with day to day, whether it's policing, education, healthcare, all those things, like those evils infect that. And those are structures that we've got to fight against and dismantle. I hope that answer was somewhat
That's a
coherent.
great answer, because it makes the point that these systems are all interrelated.
Yes.
And that can be paralyzing, because you think, oh my God, I can't
Yeah,
believe
yeah,
this.
yeah.
But
Right.
that's the other point. You have to sort of find out where can I make the biggest difference and intervene there, knowing that by influencing one system, you're also influencing potentially other systems, and you try to make sure that you have it up.
Yes, absolutely. A comrade of mine sent me, we were having a conversation about how it's unnatural and really unsustainable that we live in an information age where we can know about every tragedy that's taking place in every single moment within seconds. Like I'm not sure how healthy that is for human beings to hold. And the tweet was basically saying like, that can be overwhelming and you can feel like, well, what the crap do I do? And he said, the tweet said, that's okay. Like, understand that all these things are interlinked. And so if you're working in one area, in some way, shape, or form, it's impacting the other areas. So your answer is spot on.
Right. Nice.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments they wish to share?
Well, let me just raise one point. We live in a society where the triage is not to treat the leg, but it's to treat the trigger finger that's been injured, so we can send that person back, and say, well, we're healed, we've dealt with it. But you're talking of a different triage in your society. Where do you get hope when we know that we live in a society where the triage is not to treat the systemic evil, but just to deal with making the garden look good?
Hope is a loaded term for me. I like to put the word militant in front of hope. Militant hope, because I think sometimes the way we talk about hope, and I'm sure you're not doing this, I'm just kind of responding to your question, is like rooted in this toxic positivism or toxic positivity. It's kind of naive, it's detached from the real world. It's just kind of like this glue in the sky that like, I still have hope. And a lot of times it's used to hammer people who rightfully feel hopeless to say, hey, pull your heart bootstraps up and get some joy about you and believe that tomorrow's going to be a better day. But militant hope says, well, hope is not just like a thing I feel, it's a practice. Like you don't have hope, as Cornel West would say, you have to become a hope. And so I do have hope because one, I believe God is at work in the world. And that also always brings about infinite possibilities. Two, because I'm seeing people struggle more and more in profoundly beautiful ways, in small ways, to try to wrestle and grapple with this. And so those are seeds and signs of what could germinate and grow over time. So I have hope in conversations like this that take place. And then thirdly, I have hope because of my ancestors. My ancestors who maintain a fight for their life and breath on the hulls of slave ships. My ancestors who took the bullwhip, who took being all the daily indignities of the plantation and still somehow stealed away into the woods at night to have their own encounter with Jesus. and to believe in a God that was about freedom, and just their steadfastness, the prayers that they prayed, the songs that they sung into the wind that I think reverberate into time, and breathe on every generation of maladjusted Black folks. By maladjusted, I mean folks that just won't accommodate the world it is, aren't going to just acquiesce, are going to daily practice freedom and fight for systems and structures and social practices that are rooted in freedom. So I think those are my 3 areas of hope. God, the fact that people are struggling now and doing stuff, whether it's small or big. And thirdly, the way my ancestors, in the days when hope unborn had died, as the Black national anthem says, they kept struggling. They lived another day, and dreamed dreams and prayed prayers that I think are being answered in my generation.
Does anyone else, before we wrap up, have any other questions or comments they wish to share? Mr. Hawkins, I cannot thank you enough for being with us today.
Debbie Walker
Stacey.
has a question.
Yeah.
Hi,
Yes.
yes, thank you for helping us to understand this. If we as a group or as individuals wish to get more involved in what your work includes and how we can somehow make a difference in some area, are there recommendations that you would have in that regard?
Yeah, I believe my bio has the 3 things that I'm sort of spending my time on. And you're more than welcome to reach out via email. I'll drop my email in the chat right now. And just inquire, but I'll just briefly say, Lit City is a youth development initiative. We're preparing for our 2nd Freedom School. Sister Linda knows a little something about Freedom Schools. And I think that's important work that lots of folks could jump in and support if they so please. And if you're supporting Linda's site, please don't hop away from hers to support mine, because we're a collective. Just want to say that I'm not trying to steal support. But Lit City goes year round, mentoring, sports, fitness, leadership development, justice work. Then Drum Majors Alliance, which is a ragtag group of Christian organizers, activists, supporting grassroots work. You can check us out, check that work out. And then lastly, School of Love, which I already mentioned. But those are 3 areas that you could, explore and dialogue with me about, and we could figure out ways that might be a good on-ramp for you to engage that work. So yeah, hopefully that is a decent answer. And I think, like I said, a lot of that stuff is in my bio that's on your webpage, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank y'all for having me.
Terrance, quick question.
Sure.
Back before the pandemic, you did the Winston-Salem Freedom Rides, which I actually did in February of 2020, right before the pandemic hit and before we knew each other. But it's seeing things through different eyes. I mean, that was especially of Winston-Salem, which you do such an amazing job with that. Will those resume? I know you're so busy with everything.
Yeah.
Will they resume at all?
Yeah, so we actually did one during the pandemic virtually. It was an experiment, but we did it. It's on the Drum Majors Alliance page. I kind of steer people away from that because it's not the same. But if you wanted to engage some of that history, it's on Facebook. I actually am doing a freedom ride for a group on March 21st. I was asked to do a freedom ride for it's like a group of 15 folks. So at this point, the way we're doing it is by request. And then hopefully as we get further, if the pandemic feels everlasting, I don't want to assign that to it, but it feels like it. But hopefully as the pandemic, we get to some sense of being able to be together in a space and there not being anxieties around, folks getting sick, we'll organize our own freedom rides as we did in February. But yeah, if there are groups of folks that want to do one, you can reach out to me. And I have a friend who has a bus company that I work with for that. And it's really just, or your church may have a bus, but we try to do them in smaller numbers just for safety reasons. So yeah, those are still, well, they're beginning to happen again. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right, thank you so much. Before we wrap up, does anyone else have any questions or comments?
I got a comment. First of all, Terrence, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your teaching and your ministry. I think each person that's gathered today has glommed onto a kernel of wisdom from your experience and from your teaching. So thank you for that. Secondly, I won't be here next weekend, so I need a member of outreach to come and learn how to hook stuff up here in the vestry so that we can continue this class together or separate through Zoom. So I need a volunteer to come learn between now and Thursday. All right. And thirdly, today's sermon is going to invite participants to kind of think about our future and how do we want to go and grow in our ministry as we live into our mission strategy. So those who are online and those who are in person will be invited to lift up some of what we've learned about here today as a way of looking forward and being active in our loving God and loving our neighbors.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Terrance Hawkins. This has been fantastic. This is first of many series. This will go on for the next few weeks, building bridges for equity, justice, and community. We will have another wonderful guest speaker next week. So I invite you all to bring yourselves and bring a friend, bring a family member, and join us right here next Sunday on the 13th at 9:30. If all is good and all is right in the ways of the Lord, I thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and I hope to see as many as your bright faces in for the 11 a.m. worship. Once again, thank you and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Terrence.
Bye.
Thank you, Terrence.
Yeah.